The parking lot was a grid of metal and glass and movement, cars lined like small islands, people weaving between them with bags and footsteps, the hum of a city that never stopped. Ricardo Silva's coat caught a breeze as he swung the passenger door closed. He was late. His phone buzzed in his palm. A calendar alert blinked with the name of an investor who did not like delays. He kept his head down, eyes on the black leather of his briefcase, the small smear of coffee on his cuff he hadn't noticed. He practiced the polite expression he used for deals: neutral, efficient, unreadable. His hand reached for the car handle. "Sir, buy my drawing? Dad needs surgery." The voice was small enough that at first he thought it was a fragment of the city noise, a snippet of a radio ad, a child's echo from somewhere else. Then it landed directly beside his car. The air shifted. Ricardo's hand froze on the chrome, the world narrowed to the syllables. Dad needs surgery. He felt the repetition in his skull, the cadence like a small stone skipping insistently across still water. She stood there with her palm out, a folded piece of paper pinched between two thin fingers. The paper had been handled too many times. Crayon lines bled into each other, the edges were soft where little thumbs had smoothed them. It smelled faintly of glue and damp cloth. It was the kind of drawing that only matters to the person who made it. Helena's hair was in two uneven plaits. Her shoes were scuffed. One lace was frayed. She wore a t-shirt that had once been bright, now softened by a dozen washings. She held the drawing like an offering. Ricardo's first reaction was the reflex of every executive who walks between the glass towers and the streets: safety first. Hands quick, eyes scanning, a flinch for the unexpected. He glanced to the left, then right. No security in sight, no uniform. A woman with a stroller skirted past without meeting their eyes. A man in a coffee shop uniform hustled to the door, the bell jingling, the barista oblivious. "Hi, sir," Helena said again. Her voice had a steadiness that surprised him. No theatrical pleading, no exaggeration, just this short, honest sentence. Ricardo felt suddenly very old and very young at the same time. He had been a child once. He had grown into the man who never let himself be visible to strangers. He had built walls so well he sometimes forgot his own name. "How much?" he asked before he knew he would. $2, Helena said. "Please. $2. The price was exact, as if she had rehearsed the world into a sum. It was a number that meant smallness, like a coin found in a sofa, yet when paired with "Dad needs surgery," it swelled into something enormous. Marcelo leaned against the hood of Ricardo's car, phone to his ear, tie slashed loosened. Marcelo's laugh had the practiced edge of someone who worked in risk assessment. His jaw tightened when he saw Helena. He lowered his voice when he spoke.
"Ricardo, man, this isn't the time. Security will pick." "She asked me to buy a drawing," Ricardo said. The words came out different than he intended. They sounded like a confession. Marcelo's eyebrow rose. "It's almost always a scam. Or it turns into a thing where PR gets involved. We can't, we can't." Helena watched them from under the shadow of her braids. There was no shame on her face, only purpose, a child's economy of solutions, a father who could not work, a calendar of appointments, an envelope of bills. She had learned to translate worry into trade. She could trade the crayon picture for a process, a procedure, a chance. "What's your dad's name?" Ricardo asked, more curious than suspicious now. "Miguel," she answered. She set her shoulders as if listing a fact. "He got sick last month. He needs an operation. Mom works 2 shifts, and she says there's not enough. I drew it so someone would buy it, and then we could—" Helena took a breath. The world accepted the pause without condescension. Ricardo imagined a white light of fluorescent bulbs, a small hospital waiting room, the hum of the vending machine, the thump of time. He imagined Miguel in their small apartment, a face half in shadow. "How do I know it's true?" Marcelo asked. His voice was sharply practical. "People lie. People—" "Because I wouldn't bring a picture if it wasn't true," Helena said. She didn't sound indignant. She sounded simply factual, the way someone who had kept household counts for years might speak. "If I sell enough, he'll get the operation." Her hand rose a fraction to show the inside of her wrist, a small, faded hospital bracelet tied with red string. It was not dramatic. It did not scream for attention. It was the quiet evidence of nights in waiting rooms and hands that had held others' hands and forgotten their own. Ricardo reached into his pocket for a bill. It felt larger than $2. He found himself holding the money, then closing his fingers without handing it over. The reflex to keep distance pulled at him, the corporate caution that had cushioned his life. Verify, document, filter. He felt the old rulebook in his throat. "Give me the drawing," he said. Helena unfolded the paper. The picture was of their apartment, perhaps, 2 stick figures under a crooked sun, or a man with a band of color across his belly. The lines were earnest. A heart was scribbled in the corner. There were attempts at shadow, the world expressed in confident, clumsy marks. Ricardo paid the bill, then added another 10. He told himself it was charity. The extra would cover a taxi, he thought, a small portion of what a hospital copay might require. He handed it across. The exchange was quick and banal and intimate. Their fingers brushed. He smelled soap and something like crayons. Helena's nails were clean of dirt, but there was dust tucked into the ridges. She folded the money into her palm and tucked the drawing into her backpack like a sacred object.
"Thank you, sir," she said. "Tell my mom I'll try to bring more." Ricardo nodded. He watched her run across the lot toward a bus stop, a bird of a child in too big a city. Marcelo muttered under his breath about image and liability. He pulled at Ricardo's sleeve, a gentle tug toward the scheduled meeting and the world of arrangements that fit into spreadsheets. But Ricardo wasn't moving. He stood barefoot, in a sense, no armor between this small moment and the place inside him that still knew names and promises. For a beat, he saw the drawing in his mind like a physical thing again, and then he saw Miguel's name and the hospital bracelet. He felt the weight of his briefcase for the first time, the leather heavy with decisions he had made for other people's money. "Don't get sentimental on me," Marcelo said with a half smile that had no warmth. "We have to get to the boardroom." Ricardo brushed his hand once over the bill in his pocket. He was a man with systems. He had departments for needs. He had a foundation that sent postcards and quarterly statements. Yet those things had never begun at a parking lot with a child's voice like a burr under a machine, so precise, so easily overlooked. He told Marcelo he'd be a minute. He stepped away from the car. The colors of the parking lot rearranged into something else, a foreground and a background. The foreground was now a child with a drawing, and a father with a hospital bracelet. The background receded. He walked to the bus stop. Helena was sitting on the metal bench, knees tucked in, watching the streetlights like they might afford some small answer. She didn't ask him for anything else. She didn't try to tug at his sleeve. She had already done all the asking she knew. There was pride in her posture, a refusal to be a spectacle. "Can I know where he is?" Ricardo asked. The question turned his voice softer than usual. He heard it, and the sound was foreign. "The clinic," she said simply, "on Maple. He has a blue card for the clinic. He got the bracelet there yesterday. Do you have a phone number, an address, someone I can—" Helena fumbled into her backpack, producing a small scrap of paper with a scribbled phone number and an address he couldn't quite believe was real, a third-floor walk-up on a street named for a tree. She had written it crooked, the handwriting careful and small. Ricardo stared at the numbers. The rational part of him ticked through possibilities, a scam, a prank, a child coached into a story. The rest of him felt something like alarm, like recognition. He had sat in waiting rooms for his own father years ago. He remembered the fluorescent light, the smell of bleach, the smallness of the chairs. He remembered the exact way his father had wrapped his hands around a styrofoam cup. "Thank you," Ricardo said. He felt a constriction in his chest. He wanted to hand her more money. He wanted to promise the moon. He wanted to step out of the world of boardrooms altogether and stay in this small one, where the currency was a folded drawing. "Be careful," Marcelo said from 5 steps away. "Don't get— Look, we should just— security." Ricardo turned toward the car. His phone buzzed again. Another meeting, another page of commitments. It would have been easy to fold this moment into memory and move on, the way men with lists do. He could have filed the paper, donated the $10, hired a PR intern to say nice things. That would have been sufficient outside. It would have been clean. But when he slid into the driver's seat, the drawing caught his eye. It felt suddenly enormous. He put the bill back in his wallet and left the drawing in the crook of his arm like a child he had promised to keep safe. It rested against the interior's leather, a blotch of color in a world of neutral tones.
At his office, the glass doors hummed the exact tone of a city that measures itself in profit. His assistant greeted him with a practiced smile of someone who had learned to separate the human from the professional. He reached for his coffee and then stopped, almost as if the drawing had a gravity he could not escape. He unbuttoned his cuff to blot a stain from his sleeve. He placed the drawing on his desk next to a stack of reports, where the crayons looked at home only by contrast. He sat behind the broad desk, and for the first time all morning, he closed his eyes. He thought of Miguel. He thought of Helena's palms, the hospital bracelet, the quiet way she had offered her work for someone else's life. He thought about the smallness of $2 and how it had the shape of a threshold. A hand tapped on his office door. Marcelo's voice slipped in. Practiced concern chiseled into polite phrases. "You okay? Are you coming to the meet with the marketing team?" Ricardo finished for him, and the question had an edge. "Right," Marcelo said, easing into the room and folding himself into a chair. The skepticism in his face had softened into something else. Curiosity. "You bought the drawing?" "Only $2, Ricardo said, and the sentence sounded like both defense and accusation. Marcelo leaned forward. "Ricardo, listen. I get it. But we have to be strategic. If we get seen doing this, people will say it's a PR stunt. They will think we're buying selfies with poverty, our reputation." "It wasn't about publicity," Ricardo said. The words came with a clarity that surprised him. He looked at the paper on his desk like it might answer him. She sold it with no fanfare. She walked away with pride. Marcelo's mouth tightened. He made a gesture with his hand, an almost invisible filing of the feeling. "We should at least document contact, verify. There's a lot of stories out there." Ricardo reached for the drawing and held it to his face. The smear of green crayon looked like grass. The sun in the corner was an intentional, hopeful circle.
He smelled the paper again. Ink, and an undernote of whatever childhood smells are. Cereal dust, hand soap. "Bring in security, check the address, verify she isn't part of a con," Marcelo said. "If it's real, and if it is, then we can help, but we do it properly. No one gives us permission to be reckless." Ricardo nodded. The word proper felt suddenly cold. He had spent a career arranging things to look tidy. He had negotiated numbers until the edges were smooth. He had become an expert at doing the right thing as a bullet point on a monthly report. "Do it quietly," he said instead. "No announcements, no cameras. Just find out what's true." Marcelo blinked. "You sure? That doesn't sound like you." Ricardo opened a drawer and took out a pen. He uncapped it, and his hand did the rest. He wrote Miguel's name and the address on his own notepad, the letters steady, deliberate. The act of handwriting made the world slower, more possible. He told his assistant to put a hold on the investor meeting. The assistant's eyes widened with the kind of surprised compliance that says, "Something important is happening, and we must rearrange." It was a minor earthquake in the calendar of a man whose life ran on precision. Down the hallway, someone pressed palms to a window and watched the city, a small figure against the glass. Ricardo felt like that person sometimes, pressed against the pane, wondering if anything he did could penetrate the other side. He called his security director with a question that sounded simple on the phone and was not. "Can you check an address for me?" discreetly. "Of course," the security director said. "You want a car, sir? We can send someone." "Not now," Ricardo replied. "Just look into it. No one needs to know yet." He hung up and stared at the drawing. When the office emptied and the hum of the day lowered, Ricardo picked up the paper and turned it over. On the back, in Child's blocky handwriting, there was a scribble he had not noticed. "For Dad." It was the smallest possible thing, and it made the whole building feel like it might tilt. There was a cost to seeing. There would be a cost to acting. That was the math he had always believed in. Every moral motion required resources. Resources required decisions. Decisions required sacrifice. He left the drawing on his desk and went to a meeting, his mind a half-torn map of contingencies. He answered questions about profit and product lines with the same skill he used to navigate human impulses. He made notes on slides and nodded at the right moments, but his fingers kept finding the pen he had used to write Miguel's name. By the time the boardroom filled, Ricardo's rational mind had assembled arguments for and against involving the company. He could frame this as a philanthropic action through the foundation. He could route the help through established channels. He could make a case for employee engagement, a mentorship program, emergency medical grants, housing assistance pilots. He could create plausible outcomes and measurable metrics. He also imagined Helena's small hand, and how she had stood with the folded picture like a treaty. He imagined Miguel waiting under fluorescent lights, the low murmur of other people's lives weaving around fits and breaths. The idea that one act might alter more than a day, might change a routine that had calcified into hardship, pulled at him. Marcelo watched him, attentive to the shift. "If you want to do anything, we have to do it in a way that scales," he said during a lull. "One family is tragic, but if we help one, we need processes to help many. Otherwise, it's just optics." Ricardo looked at Marcelo, at the neatness of his argument. "We start with the one," he said. The sentence surprised them both. It had the sound of a policy decision and the flavor of a confession. Everyone around the table nodded because someone always nodded at the boss. But something in the room loosened, a permission to imagine small, human things inside a spreadsheet world. Later that afternoon, Ricardo walked back through the same parking lot. The sun was lowering, and the angles turned the cars to dark glass. He went to the bus stop where Helena had been waiting, but she was gone. He waited for a while, thinking she might return, thinking he might find her and make a new promise. She didn't return. Instead, his phone buzzed with a message, just a line of confirmation from his security director. "Address checked. 3rd floor walk-up at 214 Maple. Miguel Silva, registered at clinic under same name. Medical need flagged. Procedure recommended. No sign of fraud. Recommend discreet contact." Ricardo turned the message over in his hand like a coin. The city kept moving around him. People bent to their own needs and plans. He felt the shape of decision tightening into action. He could have at that moment called a number and arranged funds that would show up as a line item in a budget. He could have had his assistant book a plane. He could have organized a press release that framed him as a philanthropist and Helena's drawing as the catalyst. He could have done any of those efficient, clean things. Instead, he picked up the drawing and walked to the clinic on Maple. The building was older than the corporate towers, smaller and stubborn. A faded awning, the sound of muffled televisions behind the windows. It smelled of disinfectant and the tang of coffee. Ricardo paused by the steps, conscious of his suit, of his shoes made for polished floors, not concrete. People came and went. A nurse moved quickly with a chart. A man in a hoodie coughed softly by the vending machine. Ricardo almost turned away. He almost decided that investigatory distance was enough. But then a small sound reached him, a child's laughter, the kind that is quick and sharp even when threaded with worry.
He pushed open the door. The receptionist looked up at him with a neutral, practiced expression. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Is Miguel Silva here?" Ricardo asked. His voice felt oddly tentative. She tapped a keyboard, filed through a list. Her face softened when she found the file. "He's not in a room right now," she said. "He's scheduled for a consult later today." "Can I see him?" Ricardo asked, and the words had the rawness of someone who had stepped into an unfamiliar role. The receptionist hesitated. Protocols existed for him to follow, clear and sterile. She was the gatekeeper of that process. "Do you have ID? Are you family?" she asked quietly. Ricardo said no. He told her about a child selling a drawing in the parking lot. He told her he had bought it and that the child had given him an address and a name. He did not tell her he was the CEO of a company that could rearrange departments. He told her he was a man with a drawing in his hand and a small urgency in his chest. The woman at the desk smiled with the understanding of someone who saw many kinds of courage come through her doors. The courage of someone who was willing to reach past bureaucracy and insert humanity into it. She asked him to wait. She called a nurse. She walked him past a sign that read "Visiting Hours" in careful black type. He waited in a hallway that smelled of cleaning products, the antiseptic scent that makes you think of healing even when it contains no promises. A young doctor in scrubs came out, her badge bobbing against her chest. She exchanged a few words with the receptionist, then walked toward Ricardo. "Miguel's daughter sold me a drawing," Ricardo blurted. He felt foolish saying it, like explaining how rain felt to someone who had never carried an umbrella. The doctor cocked her head, curiosity replacing the professional barrier. "Helena?" she asked. "She came by earlier with a note. She said she wanted people to notice." Ricardo's throat tightened. "She's right here," he said, and the fact that he spoke the truth made the words solid. "I bought the drawing." The doctor glanced at his hands, at the paper folded into careful creases. She smiled in a way that suggested she recognized that sometimes help arrived unboxed and messy. "Miguel is in recovery," she said then.
which was neither triumph nor simple news. Ricardo felt the sentence land and make a small crack of space. Is he... He stopped himself. The thought of making promises hung in the air. That was not the way of this place. This place kept truth simple. We will do the next thing we can. You can see him, she said then. But be mindful. We need to keep support structured. The team will update you on what's needed. If you'd like to help, we have a social worker who coordinates assistance. They can talk about what the family needs and how to support in a healthy way.
Ricardo nodded, because he wanted to do the right thing, and because the idea of doing the wrong thing, of barging into someone's life like a headline, terrified him more than any spreadsheet. As he was led down the corridor, his mind made quick lists: surgical consults, short-term housing, time off for a mother who worked 2 shifts. But even as his logic assembled support models, the undercurrent of his feelings stayed simple. A child had traded art for surgery, and that trade had landed both of them in his life. He reached Miguel's room. The curtains were half drawn. Miguel was smaller than Ricardo had imagined, thin, with hair cropped close. A visitor sat in the corner, her eyes red from sleeplessness. Perhaps she was Helena's mother. Miguel lifted his head when the door opened and offered a weak smile. Helena's face flashed across Ricardo's mind. He remembered the earnest heart in the corner of the drawing. He stood there with the paper in his hand like a talisman, like a record of having been moved. Someone in the room took his hand unexpectedly, Helena's mother perhaps, or a sister, and squeezed. There were words like thank you. Miguel's voice was a soft thing. Doctor's instructions came and went. The language of the hospital felt like a different currency than the language of corporate life. Ricardo sat by the bed with the drawing between his fingers. He felt like an intruder and an ally at once. The room was small, the beep of a machine gentle and steady. He kept thinking of the bus stop and the way a child's hope could be folded into a paper square. At one point, Miguel reached out a hand. It was a small gesture, nothing theatrical. Thank you, he said, and Ricardo realized one of the most important acts of all is to be thanked by the person you intend to help. It altered the geometry of the moment. It made them equal, not patron and recipient. Outside the window, the city carried on an indifferent gloss. Inside that curtain fold, decisions began to wire from feeling into action. The doctor mentioned recovery plans. The social worker offered forms. Ricardo found himself writing down names of programs and numbers, and more dangerously, imagining what it would take to make a longer arc of help: temporary housing while Miguel recovered, a job for a caregiver, educational supplies for Helena, a small, steady stipend not to buy comfort but to buy breathing space. He kept his voice controlled in the room, careful not to make promises he could not keep. But when he left, the drawing folded in his palm like a secret. He felt the shape of something real forming, a plan that might be small but could be durable.
He had a list now that spiraled in his head, options and steps sketched on the interior of his mind. When he reached the lot, Marcelo was waiting with a brow that had deepened into a fissure of unresolved questions. "Well?" Marcelo asked. Ricardo folded the drawing with slow care and placed it into his breast pocket. "He needs surgery," he said. "The clinic recommended it. The social worker will coordinate, but they need someone to step in with help now. We can do more than a check." Marcelo inhaled, a noise that might have been a laugh or an attempt at neutrality. "And you decided to get involved because she sold a drawing in a parking lot," Ricardo said, and the words were both literal and a kind of moral arithmetic. He watched Marcelo's face, expecting contempt or ridicule, but what came was the flash of an organizational challenge, the cost and the possibility. Because a kid trusted a stranger with her work and her father's life. Marcelo scanned the lot as if searching for the PR camera his mind had conjured. "You do realize how this will look," he said. Ricardo's hand found the paper in his pocket as if by instinct. The drawing's texture was familiar now, a small map of color against his coat. "Let them look," he said. "If people see it and are moved, that's fine. But we start quietly. We begin with what they need." Marcelo looked at him, the calculus of the corporation shifting like shadows. "Do you want me involved?" he asked. "I want you to help," Ricardo replied. "Just keep it off the record for now. No cameras, no announcements. Contact the social worker. Coordinate temporary housing. Talk to HR about a job for a caregiver. See if our foundation can expedite assistance. And come with me tomorrow. There are logistics." Marcelo hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. Discreet. But if it turns messy, you know "I know," Ricardo said. He felt something open inside him that had the sound of a hinge. It was minor and precarious, and it might close again tomorrow. But for now, it swung wide and let light through. That night, at home, Ricardo laid the drawing on his kitchen table. The apartment was sparse of the comforts he had learned to value. No ostentatious displays, just quiet, clean lines, the same restraint he wore like armor. He made himself a simple dinner and did not watch the news.
He opened his laptop and drafted a short note to the foundation director. No press, no fanfare, only a few lines about a family in need and the wish to help. He could have sent the note and drawn to sleep, keeping things within the soft bounds of a single act. Instead, he found himself looking again at the child's handwriting on the back. For Dad. The words felt like a charge. At 2 a.m, unable to sleep, he walked the corridors of his building and stopped at the place's cleaning staff put up a board of local notices. A flyer for a community center, a notice for a free clinic, a poster for a donation drive.
He realized with a start that the things he had always delegated, a fund, a grant, a foundation, were now parts of the same city he moved through on his own 2 feet. He made a list, then another list. He woke the next morning with precise tasks forming into a sequence. Meet with social worker, arrange temporary housing, authorize immediate funds for the operation while the clinic sorted formalities, connect Helena's mother with HR for a possible caregiver position with flexibility. He told himself to be humble in action, quiet in motive, rigorous in follow-through. When he returned to the office, the drawing sat in his blazer like an emblem. People passed his door. The company hum resumed. But something had shifted in the code of his days. A small human exception had been made to the rules, and he felt the weight of that exception like a new instrument in his toolbox. He did what he had promised himself he would not do. He went to the communications director and asked, explicitly, that nothing be released. "We don't want this framed as a stunt," he said. "If anyone asks, say it's private philanthropy. Let the family lead the narrative." The communications director swallowed a smile that had the faint taste of relief. This was the kind of instruction that had immediate effect. Someone else prepared a confidential email to the foundation. HR began to draft language for a temporary role. Security called in a referral for a social worker. Marcelo began to set up meetings that had the practical sheen he liked. Checklists, points of contact, slots in calendars. Over the next days, the initial act of buying a child's drawing unspooled into a series of small, concrete choices. Ricardo signed off on a payment to cover immediate medical costs, arranged for a short-term unit near the clinic, and greenlit a job interview with an agreement to accommodate flexible hours for the family. He met with the social worker who explained the difference between charity and sustainable help, and he listened as if he had been given a new language. There were moments of friction. Some executives whispered about risk and precedent. A few employees speculated, some with admiration, some with suspicion, on the company's motives. Marcelo argued about process until he found the precise phrase that allowed him to feel like he had been right all along. "We will pilot a compassionate support program." But for Helena, for Miguel, for the small constellation of people whose lives had been tangled into his, the changes were immediate. The clinic scheduled the procedure within days, not weeks. A temporary room was readied. A social worker arranged for childcare and school enrollment assistance for Helena so she could finish the semester. On a quiet afternoon, Helena returned to the company parking lot, this time with a different look in her eyes. She found Ricardo in a small cafe outside the offices where he liked his coffee black and without fuss. She had a new drawing in her hand, smaller now and more carefully colored. "Sir," she said, and the title had a dignity to it, a respect and an honesty that made him look at her in a new way. "I wanted to bring you this." She unfolded the paper and handed it across the table. It was a picture of 3 figures under a sun. One had a band across his belly in blue crayon. There was a small building on the side that resembled the clinic. In the corner, in block letters, she had written, "Thank you, Mr. Silva." Ricardo felt a lump form that he would not have been able to name at first. He took the drawing with a tenderness he had not planned. The office noise filtered through the window like a distant storm. He looked at Helena. "How's your dad?" he asked. She smiled with the slow healing of someone who has watched the worst of something pass towards something else. "He had the operation," she said. "He's resting. He says hi." Ricardo let that be enough for the moment. He folded the drawing and slid it into his wallet, a private thing now in his keep. But the story did not end in that quiet exchange. Helena's drawing found its way, first pinned to a corkboard in HR, then to a wall in the staff kitchen where employees rinsed their mugs and read the message pinned beneath, "Every life matters." Conversations started that otherwise would not have happened. People began to ask about medical leave, about flexible hours, about whether the company could help employees when life took unexpected turns. The small act of a child with crayon lines had become an aperture for a larger, messy, necessary conversation. And still,
As the days moved on and the immediate needs were being attended to, doubts glimmered in corners. Marcelo remained the company's voice of caution, and some board members murmured about precedent. The media, always hungry, caught scent of a story that had the kind of pull that made headlines: a child, a drawing, a CEO who stepped in. Ricardo felt the world tilting between public interest and private commitment. He had promised Helena quiet help, but the fact of the narrative was now its own creature. He found himself writing emails in the night, trying to steer the story away from spectacle and toward structure. A fund, yes, but one rooted in respect and in measurable outcomes. He wanted to change something beyond one family. He wanted policies that treated people as human beings rather than lines in a ledger. One evening, a young employee from the community outreach group stopped by his office. She was tentative, the kind of person who worried that one voice might be a ripple and not a wave. She carried with her a portfolio of ideas: a pilot for emergency medical aid, a small community liaison post, workshops to help families navigate hospital systems. She believed in systems that listened instead of shouting. "Do you think it's possible," she asked softly, "for one small action to lead to systemic change?"
Ricardo thought of Elena's drawing in his wallet, of Miguel's hand, of the quiet of a hospital corridor. He thought of Marcelo's caution and of the hum in the staff kitchen, where now people argued, kindly, about policy. "It has to be," he said finally. "Otherwise we are just papering over cracks. Help me write the pilot. Let's start with one thing that works and make it repeatable. No announcements, no optics." She nodded, relieved. The pilot that began as a scrap of color on Ricardo's desk unfurled into a dozen small decisions, each with its own friction and momentum. He and the outreach coordinator drafted a simple framework: immediate medical assistance for urgent cases, short-term housing while a patient recovered, and a liaison to help families navigate appointments and benefits. It was purposefully modest, designed to be repeatable, measurable, and respectful of the dignity of the people it served. They called it the Compassion Pilot, an awkward name that staff would later shorten to the Pilot. The program lived first on a single spreadsheet, and then in the calendar of a social worker who became their trusted contact. The social worker had a practical bluntness Ricardo found comforting. Don't call it charity, call it relief. People need space to heal, not publicity. Within days of the clinic's recommendation, Miguel's procedure was scheduled. Ricardo signed the authorization the clinic requested and arranged for a temporary unit near the hospital so the family wouldn't shuffle between buses and tired neighborhoods. HR quietly opened a small position with flexible hours, someone to help with childcare and household maintenance while Miguel recovered, and asked if Elena's mother would consider an interview. The job was not a high corporate title, it was a real payday with steady hours and benefits that would keep the family stable beyond the immediate crisis. The small network of help settled into place like puzzle pieces finding their corners. The social worker coordinated with HR on scheduling. A team from facilities prepared a furnished unit near the clinic, clean and sober, nothing ostentatious but safe and private. A woman from the Employee Assistance Program sat with Elena's mother and walked her through forms, explaining in plain terms what support looked like and what the family would need to sustain recovery. Ricardo visited the unit twice, once with sandwiches wrapped in plain paper, once with a box of books for Elena. He kept those visits discreet, aware of the thin line he was treading between involvement and intrusion. He did not stage his presence. He did not bring cameras. He wanted help to be what it had been when he first bought the drawing, a response from one human to another, not a performance. Not everyone in the company shared his instincts. A junior executive proposed a media angle, how compassion could be brand strategy.
Another suggested a matched donation campaign that would allow employees to contribute, framed in terms of engagement metrics. Ricardo listened to each idea, weighing them against his commitment to keep the family's dignity intact. Marcelo, always the voice of procedural caution, put his objections in a different form. "We must ensure there's governance. If this is to scale, we need guardrails. Who qualifies? How do we protect privacy?" He asked questions that turned warmth into policy, and in doing so, he did the work Ricardo himself already imagined, making the Compassionate Act durable. They drafted eligibility criteria that were not a gauntlet, but a filter to protect families from the onslaught of attention. They agreed on privacy agreements and on a single point of contact in the social work team who would speak for the family if outside parties asked questions. The rules were designed to protect Miguel and Elena from becoming simples or sound bites. And yet, something slipped through the careful mesh. A maintenance worker in the office kitchen took a photo of Elena's initial drawing, pinned to the HR corkboard with nothing more than a small note, and posted it to a local community group. The image was simple: a sun, 3 stick figures, a heart in the corner. The caption read, "This is why we help." The post gathered shares like ripples in a pond. Within hours, a local blogger wrote a short piece about the child who had sold her drawing. Someone else tweeted a photo of Ricardo's hand holding the crayon paper, and before long the story marched out of the company's quiet channels into the public square. It reached a morning show, then a national site. The headline asked the question the world liked to ask about any human interest piece: who was the CEO and why had he done this? Ricardo felt the swell of attention, the way a man feels the phone vibrate in his pocket, urgent and inevitable. He had asked for discretion and then, by acting, created a story that refused to remain private. He could have leaned into it, delivered a scripted message, and watched donations and praise flow. Instead, he chose to use the attention to build something that would outlast a headline. He convened a small meeting, and he said plainly, "We won't weaponize this, but we will use the momentum to build structures that help more than one family. If the world is looking, let it see the pilot and how it works as a model, not a spectacle." The company communications team braced for fallout. The board braced for questions. Marcelo braced for nuance. They issued a brief statement: no photo ops, no staged visits, only a clear description of the pilot and an offer to partner with local clinics. The press had already painted a picture of a lone man moved by a child. Ricardo altered the frame.
He made the point that the work would be measurable: short-term housing placements, number of surgeries coordinated, and follow-up to ensure the family did not fall into the kind of instability that demands repeated crisis responses. The public responded with the mix humanity always seems to produce: praise, suspicion, curiosity. People forwarded the drawing and wrote comments about the power of noticing a small voice in a parking lot. Some accused the company of seeking a PR win. Others pointed to the necessity of private wealth stepping into gaps the public sector left vulnerable. Opinions twined together like threads in a tapestry, complex and not wholly satisfying. Inside the company, the pilot began to make tangible shifts. The employee assistance program saw an increase in inquiries, not because staff were suddenly whiny, but because they had new language to ask for help. A young project manager who had been quietly struggling with a parent's illness came forward and applied for assistance without fear of being judged. A facilities worker who never thought the company would notice the plight of its contractors found herself offered counseling sessions paid by the new pilot fund. In the staff kitchen, where the drawing had first been pinned, conversations changed tone. People who had once joked about the impossibility of balance now asked about sick leave policies and how the company might accommodate lives that didn't fit neatly into job descriptions. For Helena and Miguel, the change was immediate and intimate. Miguel's operation proceeded, careful and professional. The doctors did what doctors do: assess, operate, monitor. And the social worker managed the logistics that kept the family whole: travel arrangements, a place to sleep close to the clinic, a schedule that allowed Helena's mother to work and be present for post-op care. Ricardo did not make promises. He provided scaffolding. He told the mother plainly, "We will walk it through with you. We will not make you a story." Recovery was not miraculous. It was stubborn, slow, and ordinary. Miguel awoke and slept and ate when the doctors permitted. He learned to guard a new scar and to accept help for tasks he had always felt he should manage alone. The family moved into the temporary unit, and for the first time in months could rest without calculating bus fares for every appointment. Helena went back to school with new notebooks and a backpack brought by an HR volunteer. She kept the same pride in her shoulders, but now she walked with the small security of being seen. Ricardo visited twice more during the recovery, both times finding ways to be present without being performative. He brought practical things: groceries, headphones for Miguel's low-volume TV, a small lamp for Helena's homework. He listened when Helena told him about class and about her favorite crayon color.
Each item he brought had a mundane dignity to it, the kind of help that says, "We will keep the lights on so you can live through this." Marcelo watched the changes with a mixture of skepticism and, gradually, respect. He argued for processes, for criteria, for outcomes. Then he walked the unit with the social worker and saw how a bed made a person less exhausted and how a steady paycheck could prevent a small emergency from becoming a cascading disaster. He came to see that his legalisms could be allies to compassion. Governance made aid sustainable. Structure made aid repeatable. The pilot, over the next months, stayed intentionally small. It treated privacy as the highest virtue. For families that accepted help, there were confidentiality forms and a single white-gloved point of contact. For the company, the program produced spreadsheets with numbers and, more importantly, stories with faces hidden when requested. They counted hospital stays shortened, emergency motel nights avoided, and families kept together. They counted the number of employees who used new leave policies without fear. Word of the program's design began to travel through the local philanthropic networks. Other companies asked for blueprints. A neighborhood clinic asked for training on how to refer cases discreetly. A community college approached HR about a partnership to place flexible apprenticeships for people who needed to work while caregiving. The pilot did what small programs do when they are careful. It seeded possibilities. Not all responses were tidy. A reporter from a national outlet tracked down Helena's block and sat outside the building, hoping for a dramatic quote. The social worker, protective of the family, refused to allow interviews. The company reiterated its commitment to privacy. Ricardo wrote a short message to employees. "We did this because it was the right thing to do, not because it would make headlines. Our job now is to make sure this is not a single act, but a pattern of care." At a town hall, a staff member asked Ricardo, quietly, what he had learned from the child who offered a drawing. He answered without theatricality. "She reminded me that systems can be human, that sometimes the smallest things point to the largest needs. We can build systems that respond to that." The board watched metrics and the human stories that arrived in the social worker's monthly report. The initial uneasiness softened as measurable outcomes accumulated. The fund did not solve all inequity. It did not pretend to. But when an employee counselor reported fewer crises and higher retention among staff who had once felt unsupported, the conversation in the boardroom shifted. Compassion began to be framed not as a liability, but as part of employee stability and, oddly, productivity. The language of hearts and spreadsheets found a fragile common ground. Helena's drawing moved through the company in small, quiet ways.
An employee from facilities, with the family's consent, framed the new drawing Helena made after Miguel's operation, a picture of 3 figures under a bright sun, and hung it in a low-traffic hallway where employees could see it between meetings. Someone wrote a short note and left it. "For the reasons we remember why we work." The wall became a point of human contact, not a shrine. One afternoon, Helena came to the office again. She'd been invited, only after conversations with the family and with careful permission, to show a small group of staff the new picture. The group was small. People from HR, the outreach team, Marcelo, and Ricardo. The room hummed with the ordinary sound of a workplace, but the air between them had a different density now, as if gentleness had been another resource to deploy. Helena unfolded her drawing and held it with both hands. "My dad says thank you," she said. Her voice was plain and steady. "He's getting stronger. He says he didn't know people would help like this." Ricardo watched her, feeling again that particular weight of being seen, and also of being responsible for the consequences of that visibility. He asked nothing of her. He merely listened as she described her father's recovery, and how she had drawn the new picture at the kitchen table, on a night when everyone felt hopeful enough to joke. The staff in the room found themselves quiet. A project manager wiped an eye discreetly. Marcelo, who had been all procedure, offered a small, sincere smile that said less about policy and more about human relief. Some weeks later, the company held a private gathering to discuss the pilot's next steps. The outreach coordinator presented data: number of families assisted, average duration of support, percentage of cases where short-term housing prevented longer hospital stays due to missed appointments. The numbers were small but meaningful. More importantly, the coordinator shared anonymized stories, cases in which a temporary bed near a clinic had kept a person in treatment and out of emergency rooms.
Ricardo listened and then proposed a modest expansion. He insisted on 3 principles: privacy, measurability, and collaboration with local providers. He also insisted that the family remain the narrators of their own experience. If they choose to tell their story, he said, we will support how they want it told. If they choose silence, we will guard it. Even as the program matured, the world's appetite for narratives persisted. A viral clip surfaced. Someone had filmed the first exchange in the parking lot, the brief moment when Ricardo paid the $2 and Helena ran away clutching the paper. The clip had been snatched, edited, and looped into a dozen social feeds. Comments flooded in: praise, questions, skepticism. Some commentators called it a PR stunt. Others called it a reminder to look up. Ricardo could have used the moment to broadcast a message.
Instead, he released a short statement. A child's small courage can be a catalyst. We should all look for ways to make our systems more humane. He refused interviews that centered on his image and instead asked the public, simply, to consider support for local clinics and to vote for policies that made healthcare accessible. In a rare public act, he directed people who wanted to help to verified community organizations that supported low-income patients. The public response was uncategorized. Some applauded, some stayed skeptical, and some, most quietly, donated to the clinics that had stabilized Miguel. The pressure of attention ebbed and flowed, never entirely gone, but the pilot's work continued in the spaces attention does not reach: the hospital floors, the HR check-ins, the kitchen tables, and temporary units. Months later, Miguel's recovery settled into the kinds of rhythms ordinary people know: follow-up appointments, adjustments to medication, quiet days at home. He began to work part-time, slowly easing back into labor that respected his recovery. The family, with the support of steady pay and a stable home, found a footing that felt less like treading water and more like walking. Ricardo watched these developments with a tempered joy. The work changed something in his pattern of decisions. He set a recurring budget for the pilot within the foundation, not as a one-off gesture, but as an ongoing program. He asked HR to codify emergency leave and to create a confidential referral system for employees facing medical crises. He requested reports every quarter, not to produce headlines, but to learn. What surprised him most was the quiet ripple in the company's culture. People began to notice things they had previously tuned out: a part-time cleaner with a broken washing machine, an engineer with a parent in hospice, a janitor who needed flexible hours to care for a sick child. Small acts of noticing, buying an extra lunch, offering a shift swap, covering a short-term need, multiplied in a way that statistics could not fully capture. The company did not transform overnight into a philanthropic utopia, but it became, incrementally, a place where human needs were visible in meetings usually governed by lines on a balance sheet. Marcelo, who had once muttered about optics and precedent, came to one of the outreach trainings and spoke for the first time not in counsel, but in personal reflection. Process matters, he said, but I learned that process can be a vessel for compassion. It doesn't have to dry it out. His admission had the modesty of someone who had changed his mind in the face of practical results. On a rainy afternoon, the company's internal newsletter featured, with permission, an image of Helena's second drawing framed in a shared space. The caption read simply, "A reminder that small things matter." Employees paused as they poured coffee and scrolled, and for a moment the pace of the office slowed.
Helena, who had become both a literal and symbolic presence in the company's story, was invited to participate in a small staff workshop about empathy. She drew in a corner while adults discussed policy, and when someone asked her about her favorite color, she answered with the ease of a child who had been asked such questions her whole life. "Blue," she said. It was a detail Ricardo would remember for months, the way someone remembers the shade of the sky on a decisive day. The final symbol of the story was quiet, chosen with the family's consent. Not a plaque or a staged photograph, but a small framed drawing hung in the building's community room, a place where staff collected donations for food drives and where employees could post community resources. The frame carried a brief note the family had written themselves: "From our hands to yours, with thanks." The drawing occupied a humble corner of the room, visible to anyone who stopped to tie a shoelace or heat a lunch. The press never completely forgot the image of the CEO who had bought a child's drawing. Some outlets continued to write about him in the context of philanthropy and power. But the deepest change was not the headlines. It was the way a single transaction bent a few lives into a new trajectory. A family given space to recover, a company nudged toward humane policy, a child whose crayon heart was kept safe on a wall. One evening, months after Miguel's operation, Ricardo stood in the community room and looked at the drawing. The colors had faded a little from the light, but were still earnest.
He remembered the sound of Helena's voice in the parking lot, the exact syllables that had stopped him. "Sir, buy my drawing? Dad needs surgery." He thought of the chain of practical choices that followed: schedules, housing units, social worker conversations, and how each small, sometimes bureaucratic action had been an act of care. He folded the memory into a different kind of ledger, not one of profit and loss, but one that measured breaths saved and nights of rest purchased. He understood, with a kind of slow clarity, that the most radical thing he had done was simple. He had looked. When Helena stopped by the office one last time, she'd come to the community room to show Ricardo a new drawing she'd made for school. She brought with her a small, folded paper. She handed it to him with the customary politeness of a child who had learned to say thank you and to be seen. On the paper, in careful block letters, she had written 3 words: "We are okay." Ricardo held the paper and felt the bluntness of its truth. It was not the end of every problem. It was a precise update. They were okay. For now. The statement was enough. It was the kind of closure that does not pretend to be a finale, but instead denotes a sustained path forward.
As he watched Helena leave the building, her backpack bouncing, a small figure in a vast city, Ricardo found himself wondering aloud, not as a PR line, but as a real question to the people who had gathered with him. Who will you notice today? The room arranged itself into small responses: a person who would call their neighbor, someone who would donate to a clinic, a manager who would better listen to an employee's request for time. The question worked the way it was meant to. It redirected attention. Outside, the parking lot hummed with the rhythm it had the day Helena first called to him. People moved between aisles of cars, lives intersecting briefly, then diverging. The city was not instantly kinder, nor had one act erased structural inequities. But in one building, in one company, a policy had shifted. In one family, recovery had gained ground. And in one man who had once been distant, a human habit had been restored. Ricardo went back to his desk and placed Helena's new drawing into the company archive, a small folder of stories of assistance, kept private and guarded. He did not frame the deed as heroic. He filed it as he would file any other matter of consequence, with care and an eye for the future. The world outside continued to remark on the odd coincidence that a CEO's small, immediate compassion had been a story people returned to, but Ricardo found his satisfaction in the private, ongoing parts of the work. Months later, at a modest gathering in the community room, a cloth was laid over a simple plaque the company had commissioned, not for Ricardo, not for publicity, but to honor the idea the drawing had represented. When the cloth was removed, it showed a quote chosen by the family themselves that read, "Notice and do what you can." There were no photographs in the press release, just a note that the company was formalizing a small program in partnership with local clinics to respond to emergency medical needs and to provide bridge housing when required. Helena's drawing remained in its humble frame, not the centerpiece of any campaign, but a quiet reminder penned to a wall where people took their lunch. Sometimes someone would stop and read the family's brief note beside it. Sometimes an employee walking through would remember to offer an extra shift to a colleague in need. The title, the line that had cut through that busy parking lot months before, echoed differently now. "Sir, buy my drawing. Dad needs surgery." It had been a plea, a transaction, a pivot. It had become a story of follow-through, a child's sacrifice that summoned sustained compassion, a CEO's decision that moved beyond the immediate to the structural, a company's willingness to test a new set of policies. And if the world was shocked by the CEO's reaction, it was not because he had made a glamorous rescue.
The shock lay elsewhere, in the simple fact that someone with power had chosen to be inconvenienced, to trade the tidy rhythm of meetings for the messy exigencies of another family's life. The shock came from remembering that attention to the small, sacrificial gestures of a child can lead to practical, lasting help. When you pass a parking lot or walk past a person holding a drawing, what do? Do you look? Do you reach into your pocket? Do you cross the street? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder to to notice the people beside them.